This is a necessary assumption question. We can tell because we're depending on the assumption. That means in order to have a valid argument, we need this assumption. And if we deny the necessary assumption, looking at the contrapositive here, we should no longer have a valid argument. That's one way to test the necessary answer choice. When you deny it and it's really needed, bad things should happen to the argument. And so the conclusion here is that mercury levels in saltwater fish are higher now than they were 100 years ago. And that's because we're looking at these stuffed seabirds from the 1880s, and they only have half the mercury level as living birds, the feathers from them rather. And mercury accumulates in the feathers and is derived from fish eaten by the birds. So the mercury comes from the fish eaten. So these old birds only had half the mercury of the new birds. And so we're concluding that the fish out there must have more mercury in them. That's one possible explanation for this, but you should play devil's advocate. Is there another way that these old birds might end up with only half the mercury level as these living birds? And one thing that occurred to me is, what if they're only half as old, right? Because mercury accumulates as the fish is eaten by the birds. So if these old birds are only 2 years old and the living birds are 4 years old, they should have twice as much mercury in them. And it's not because fish today have more intense levels of mercury, just because they ate more fish over their lifetime. They had more time to accumulate. So we're assuming, first of all, that seabirds eat sea fish, not freshwater fish. I know this is kind of an obvious assumption, but it's still an assumption that's being made. And we're also assuming that the higher mercury level isn't because the living birds ate more fish. These are the assumptions that I saw ahead of time. And so I'm looking to state either one of them. I don't want to overstate them because then you don't need it anymore. So as with all necessary assumption questions, we say we want to state the assumption weakly. Let's go ahead and check the answer choices out. Now I talked about denying the assumption to see if it's necessary, and when you deny the right answer, it should be bad for the argument. I especially like to do that when the answer is already phrased in the negative, because then you can just make it easier to deny, you just say it in the positive. So A is saying that the proportion of seabirds' diet consisting of fish wasn't as high in the 1800s as it is today. Well, I don't think we're assuming that. In fact, if that were true, that would be an alternate explanation. If the old birds didn't eat as much fish as today's birds, that explains why they had a lower mercury level without it being true that today's birds have a higher, more intense level of mercury. This at face value is bad for the argument. And so if we deny it and we say that the proportion of fish in their diet was as high on average as it is today, that actually helps the argument out. And when you deny the answer choice, you want it to hurt, not help. This hurts at face value, and it helps when we deny it. It's not what we need. We need the opposite of A. We are assuming that the proportion of fish in their diets is the same. Is as high, rather. So the amount of mercury in a saltwater fish depends on the amount of pollution. We don't need that to be true. We're not going that far. We're not talking about where the mercury comes from, where the conclusion stops at the point where it says today's fish must have a higher mercury level. But it doesn't really, we don't need to know where it comes from. Mercury derived from fish is essential. That's really strong for the normal growth of feathers. We don't need to know that it helps in any way. We can just find it in the feathers and talk about how intense it was in the diet of the fish, or rather in the diet of the birds. But we don't need to know that it's essential. Stuffed birds whose feathers were tested were not fully grown. We are actually assuming that the birds are the same age. So again, just like answer choice A, I feel like we're assuming the opposite of this at face value. When we deny D and say the old birds were fully grown, that helps the argument because it takes away an alternate explanation. Just like saying the fish was the same proportion of their diet as it used to be. That helps the argument because it takes away an alternate explanation. So both A and D are probably tempting answer choices. They're just the opposites of things that you need. You need to know that the proportion was as high. You don't need to know that the stuffed seabirds were fully grown, but we're assuming that they're as old as the living birds. Finally, the process used to preserve birds in the 1880s did not substantially decrease the amount of mercury. Well, this is phrased in the negative too. What if it did? What if the process of preserving these birds reduced their mercury level? That explains why they only had half the level of mercury, and it has nothing to do with their diet. And so when you deny answer choice E, it's really bad for the argument because it suggests an alternate explanation for the data, and that's how you know that you need E. You need it at face value because it's ruling out an alternate explanation. If the preservation process substantially reduces the amount of mercury in the feathers, that's really bad for the argument. And so E is the necessary one here. I bet these are the most tempting wrong answer choices, and they are the opposites of something that you would need. Well, and D is close, You don't need it to be fully grown, but you need him to be the same age.